Part 7, Chapter 2. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. The special camps must have been among the best-loved brainchildren of Stalin's old age. After so many experiments in punishment and re-education, this ripe perfection was finally born. A compact, faceless organization of numbers, not people, psychologically divorced from the motherland that bore it, having an entrance but no exit, devouring only enemies and producing only industrial goods and corpses. It is difficult to imagine the paternal pain which the visionary architect would have felt if he had witnessed in turn the bankruptcy of this great system of his. While he yet lived, it was shaken, it was giving off sparks, it was covered with cracks, but probably caution prevailed and these things were not reported to him. If the great Coryphaeus had lived a year or 18 months longer, it would have been impossible to conceal these explosions from him, and his weary, senile brain would have been burdened with a new decision, either to abandon his pet scheme and mix the camps again, or, on the contrary, to crown it by systematically shooting all the index-lettered thousands. But, amid weeping and wailing, the thinker died, and soon afterward his frozen hand brought crashing down his still rosy-cheeked, still hale and vigorous comrade in arms, the minister of those extraordinarily extensive, intricate, and irresolvable internal affairs. The fall of the archipelago's boss tragically accelerated the breakdown of the special camps. Number patches, the supreme discovery of the 20th century prison camp science, were hurriedly ripped off, thrown away, and forgotten. It hardly mattered when the bars had also been removed from hut windows and locks from hut doors, so that the special camps had lost the pleasant jail-like peculiarities which distinguished them from corrective labor camps. They also lifted restrictions on correspondence, which more than anything had made prisoners in special camps feel really buried alive. They even allowed visits. Dreadful thought, visits! The tide of liberalism swept on so irresistibly over the erstwhile special camps that prisoners were allowed to choose their own hairstyles. Instead of credit accounts, instead of special camp coupons, the natives were allowed to handle ordinary Soviet currency and settle their bills with cash-like people outside. Carelessly, recklessly they demolished the system which had fed them, the system which they had spent decades weaving and binding and lashing together. And were those hardened criminals at all mollified by this pampering? They were not. On the contrary, they showed their depravity and ingratitude by adopting the profoundly inappropriate, offensive, and nonsensical word, Beryaites. And now, wherever something upset them, they would yell this insult at conscientious convoy guards, long-suffering warders, and their solicitous guardians, the camp chiefs. Not only did the word pain the tender-hearted practical workers, it could even be dangerous so soon after Beria's fall, because someone might make it the starting point of an accusation. For this reason, the head of one of the Kenjir camp divisions was compelled to deliver the following address from the platform. Men! In those few short years, from 1954 to 1956, they found it impossible to call the prisoners men. You may hurt the feelings of supervisory staff and the convoy troops by shouting Beryaites at them. Please stop it. To which the diminutive V.G. Vlasov replied, Your feelings have been hurt in the last few months, but I've heard nothing but fascist from your guards for 18 years. Do you think we have no feelings? And so the major promised to cut out the abusive word, fascist. A fair trade. After all these pernicious and destructive reforms, we may consider the separate history of the special camps concluded in 1954, and need no longer distinguish them from corrective labor camps. Throughout the topsy-turvy archipelago, easier times set in from 1954 and lasted till 1956, an era of unprecedented indulgences. Historians attracted to the 10-year reign of Nikita Khrushchev, when certain physical laws to which we had grown accustomed suddenly seemed to stop operating, when objects miraculously began defying the forces in the electromagnetic field, defying the pull of gravity, will inevitably be astounded to see how many opportunities were briefly concentrated in those hands, and how playfully, how frivolously they were used before they were nonchalantly tossed aside. Endowed with greater power than anyone in our history except Stalin, a power which, though impaired, was still enormous, he used it like Krylov's Mishka in the forest clearing, rolling his log first this way, then that, then all to no purpose. He was given the chance to draw the lines of freedom 3 times, 5 times more firmly, and he failed to understand his duty, abandoned it as though it were a game. For space, for maize, for rockets in Cuba, for Berlin ultimatums, for persecution of the church, for the splitting of the Oblast party committees, for the battle with abstract art. He never carried anything to its conclusion, least of all the fight for freedom. Stir him up against the intelligentsia? Nothing could have been simpler. Use his hands, the hands that wrecked Stalin's camps, to reinforce the camps now? That was easily achieved. And just think when. In 1956, the year of the 20th Congress, the first orders limiting relaxation of the camp regime were promulgated. They were extended in 1957, the year when Khrushchev achieved undivided power. But the caste of practical workers was still not satisfied. Scenting victory, they went over to the offensive. We can't go on like this. The camp system is the main prop of the Soviet regime, and it is collapsing. Yielding to this pressure without examining anything closely, without pausing to reflect that crime had not increased in those last 5 years, or that if it had, the causes must be sought in the political system, without considering how these new measures could be squared with his faith in the triumphal advance of communism, or attempting to study the matter in detail, or even to look at it with his own eyes. This Tsar, who had spent all his life on the road, light-heartedly signed the order for nails to knock the scaffold together again quickly, in its old shape and as sturdy as ever. And all this happened in the very year, 1961, when Nikita made his last expiring effort to tug the cart of freedom up into the clouds. It was in 1961, the year of the 22nd Congress, that a decree was promulgated on the death penalty in the camps for terrorist acts against reformed prisoners, in other words, stoolies, and against supervisory staff, something which had never happened. And the plenum of the Supreme Court confirmed, in June 1961, regulations for 4 disciplinary categories in camps, Khrushchev's camps now, not Stalin's. When he climbed onto the Congress platform for another attack on Stalin's tyranny, Nikita had only just allowed the screws of his very own system to be turned no less tight, and he sincerely believed that all this could be fitted together and made consistent. The camps today are as approved by the party before the 22nd Congress. 6 years later, they are just as they were then. They differ from Stalin's camps not in regime, but in the composition of their population. There are no longer millions and millions of 58s, but there are still millions inside, and just as before, many of them are helpless victims of perverted justice, swept in simply to keep the system operating and well fed. Rulers change, the archipelago remains. It remains because that particular political regime could not survive without it. If it disbanded the archipelago, it would cease to exist itself. Every story must have an end. It must be broken off somewhere. To the best of our modest and inadequate ability, we have followed the history of the archipelago from the crimson volleys which greeted its birth to the pink mists of rehabilitation. In the glorious period of leniency and disarray on the eve of Khrushchev's measures to make the camps harsher again, on the eve of a new criminal code, let us consider our story ended. Other historians will appear, historians who, to their sorrow, know the Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev camps better than we do. 2 have in fact appeared already, S. Karavansky and Anatoly Marchenko, and they will float to the surface in great numbers. End of Part 7, Chapter 2.